this relationship between these three sets of things. Okay, whoops.
Can we back to you?
Yeah. Okay, Lisa, are you there now? We've lost
Hi,
Lisa.
Steve. Yes, I am. I had.
Oh, sorry. Can you allow me to share screen, please?
Yes, sure. 1 second.
Oh, still disabled.
If you go to share screen at the bottom.
Yeah, just not offering me. It's saying host disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, just a minute.
Okay, you have to override that.
For some reason it said I'm now hosting this meeting. Nothing to do with me.
Oh, you've been promoted, Duncan.
Sorry, I've just had a power cut and everything's gone crazy. So
Oh no, okay, all right. Well, let's just
you lost
carry on.
me, so.
Don't worry then, don't worry. We'll carry on to work.
Who was the host?
Duncan.
Duncan. Ask Duncan to transfer host to you.
Okay, can you transfer host to me, Duncan?
How do I do?
I'm not quite sure.
Steve, you're a host.
Oh, I got it now. I got it now. Great.
You don't have to transfer. Duncan shouldn't be a host. He's not up here and the controls as host. So.
Okay, got it. Okay, can everybody see that? Ethics in permaculture.
Yes.
Screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. So here we go. We're defined by our values and our actions, and I think that it's so important is to operate within sort of in a consistent way within a sort of this ethical framework. So I'm going to explore that a little bit. And years ago, so we set up. I started a housing cooperative in 1995 called Chicken Shack. And I started with one of my friends, and he was. This is a quote from his father, and he said, "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything." And I thought that was really interesting about if you're not implicit about your own values, you can be easily persuaded to think other things. And what I found, the more I've thought about and worked on the permaculture ethics, the more certain I felt about what I'm doing and whether it's right or not, or whether it's going to take me in the right direction. And I think there's a lot of people out there in the world at the moment trying to influence us and maybe sort of distort our sense of reality. And I think it's also very interesting, very important to be informed and accept information from other people, but not to lose your place in things and sort of become a bit lost. And I think in this modern world that happens a lot. So I kind of like that idea. And there's a picture of myself with Gerald and Godfrey in the green t-shirts, and Vicky. It's our training team and that's out in northern Uganda. We've been working with refugees from South Sudan. That can go off now, for now.
That's mirroring what you should be seeing on your second screen. Ask people what they're seeing.
They're seeing the right thing, seeing the ethics thing.
Okay.
Yeah, so that can go off, yeah. Okay. All right. So we're not alone in thinking about these things. Lots of people around the world obviously been working on what originally were called the Millennium Development Goals. And over time, so that was obviously 20 years ago now. Goodness, 20 years since 2000. What a fuss we made about that. Anyway, and then so the Millennium Development Goals, this is the United Nations joint, whatever they call it, task force. They bring together many different agencies. And we know there's obviously a great many charitable organizations and foundations and things working around the world. So there was a real attempt, sort of 20 or so years ago, to actually identify what these goals are, what it is that we're trying to achieve. And if you listen to the Johan Rockström lecture, he said basically, if we tackle climate change, if we can do the Paris Agreement, the only way that we're actually going to do that is by resolving all 17 of the SDGs. And they're all enormous. But it reminds us that, look, rule number one SDG number 1, no poverty. Yeah, just do that tomorrow, shall I? Okay, that's quite ambitious. But it instantly brings us into a mindset that whatever it is that we're doing, it has to include everybody. We've got to bring everyone with us. No poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, quality education, gender equality, clean water and sanitation for everyone. And I think there's something that's really become apparent in the COVID-19 crisis, is that public health has to be for everyone. It's not public health if it's not reaching everyone. And if we've got pandemic diseases and endemic diseases, then if we can't give everybody access to healthcare, then there's always going to be a reservoir of infection. There's always going to be a reinfection. So the kind of healthcare for profit, selected entry kind of thing, especially what we're seeing in the States and as our own NHS gets changed, is really taking us in the wrong direction, because we've got to come up with strategies that for everybody. And also we know that most of the sources of disease come from lack of clean water and sanitation. It's actually quite easy to remove a lot of distress from the world, but actually addressing the core of the issues. And we're gonna touch on all of these things as we go through the course. So number 7 is affordable and clean energy. Well, there is an absolute transformation going on across the world at the moment, and we are getting off oil as fast as we can. The coal industry is collapsing, natural gas is in all sorts of trouble, and we should have done all of this decades ago, and we know it. So we've left it very, very late to move to clean energy systems. Again, I'll be expanding on that and talking about the energy sort of paradigms a bit later on. SDG number 8, I don't fully agree with. The idea of so decent work completely and a strong, stable economy, but economic growth, I'm not so sure about. I think we've reached the end of economic growth. I don't think we need to be accelerating our economy anymore. I think we need to be making much better use of what we've got. Industry, innovation and infrastructure. Obviously, you can't have a good strong economy without an infrastructure underpinning that. Reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities as a massive world of urban permaculture. We've already talked a bit about who people got land and farms and nice gardens and things, but you can really do permaculture in cities. And there's a wonderful book by Toby Hemingway on urban permaculture. And what I'd like to say to people on that subject is, in cities, you just have a different set of opportunities and a different set of resources and a different set of limiting factors. But in cities, you have many people. It's really easy to make compost because there's loads of food waste and cardboard and wood chip and things like that. And you might have much less physical space, but cities are full of funny little odd truncated bits of land and road verges and railway sidings and dead industrial areas, all of which can be rehabilitated very, very easily. And we've had a lot of interesting urban food growing projects. Cultivate in Newtown was a 5-year project, which I will present about later on, and just kind of showing how it's possible to adapt almost any landscape or space to make it productive and to make it wildlife friendly. I think one of the big issues within cities is transport, and I think we have to get cars out of cities as quickly as possible. And there's lots of interesting strategies to think about how we can de-car our world. Obviously, out in rural Paris, it's going to be a bit harder, or close to impossible, but it's certainly essential in cities. And everybody has noticed during the COVID shutdown how quickly the air quality has improved in cities. And I think that's an amazing opportunity for us all to realize that we can't go back on this. We are letting all of ourselves down horribly. I don't claim to have any special insight about COVID-19. I'm not medical or anything, but we've been following a doctor called Zach Bush. He's from Hawaii in America. He has a very interesting take on it. And in fact, he talks a bit about permaculture in his presentation. So he's an evolutionary biologist, and he's really interested in viruses and bacteria, in the microbes, and we're going to be talking about microbes quite a lot. 99% of all life on Earth is microscopic. We forget that when we talk about biodiversity. Zach Bush says that viruses that they're the building blocks of evolution. They're just little bits of DNA that float around and insert themselves into other cells. And I don't know, something went beep. I don't know what that means. And that's actually the mechanism of evolution. And he points out that there's a very strong correlation between particulate air pollution and the veracity of the virus and how people are affected by it. And there seems to be very deep and important links between air quality in cities and public health, and also from agricultural residues as well. So all of these things really fit into our sustainable cities and communities. We can't be living and breathing really toxic, polluted air and expect there not to be major consequences. Responsible consumption and production. I think some of these overlap actually, but anyway, climate action, life below water, life on land, peace, justice, and strong institutions. So again, it's sustainability, facing climate change is you can see through these, is it's very much about tackling many social issues and bringing everybody in on board, inclusive, and a much more inclusive approach to development and to society. In 17, partnerships for these goals. We've got to work together. We can't all be specialists in all of these areas. We have to find the areas where we can be most effective, but understand that we're all working together as part of this much bigger picture. So that's the SDGs. This is what's come to us from United Nations. Now, we think slightly differently, but it's interesting to see how they correlate. So the first, we're going to kind of look at the world through three lenses, three zones. And the first one is about the most important thing in the world, me, or could be you. From your own perspective, nothing's actually more important than yourself. And I don't think that that's selfish. It doesn't have to be selfish. Our first objective in life is to meet our own needs, okay? So you have to ask yourself, what are my needs? Well, we all need air and clean water and food and things like that. There's another way that I think about this, which is if you happen to be on a jet plane, an aeroplane, they say to you, don't they, in the unlikely event of the cabin depressurizing, an oxygen mask will descend in front of your face. Please put your mask on first before you help anyone else. Because if you're there sorting out your kids and your gran and everybody else, and you go blue in the face and pass out because you didn't put your mask on, now someone's got to look after you. So it's not selfish to take care of your own needs first. But in permaculture, we say we have to set limits to our own consumption. So you're also asking yourself all the time is, you know, am I taking more than I need? Now, our first objective really is to think about ourselves, meet our own needs, so that we are able to help others. And the next thing we don't need to be aware of is everybody else is doing the same thing. They're also trying to meet their own needs. And what we need to think about is a little bit more, is to be slightly less selfish and more conscious that other people are also just striving to meet their own needs. And actually, the more we can collaborate, the more that we can kind of explore this overlap area between my needs and what the community needs, then is there a possibility that in the way that I'm working to meet my needs, I'm helping other people achieve the same thing, and creating a synergy, a kind of a mutual energy between it? And I think that's something very important to think about. So our society has really fractured us off to make us really, really, really selfish and really, really wrapped up in ourselves. And we don't really think in any way enough about how that impacts on other people, or how we might be able to create a synergy with the people around us. So it seems to me always instinctive is to try and help yourself in a way which also helps other people. And I'll just give you a really simple example. In our little community in Florida, we get a sumo order every month. We get a bulk order from the Whole Food Co-op, which is a social enterprise. Sumo is the biggest worker co-op in Britain. So we're very happy to be customers of them. And there's kind of a minimum order. You need to bulk buy to get a free delivery. And so what we do is we share with all of our people in our street. And it's just a very simple way in which we help meeting our needs and helping other people to meet theirs at the same time. It's just it's a small example, but it becomes a very, very important idea as we move forward. Oops. What happened then? Oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, so sorry about that. The third area of interest in permaculture is, well, obviously, is to think about the natural world. We're part of a living, breathing system that's dynamic, complex, and connects everything else together. And everything that we're doing individually or as a community really is also interfacing and interacting very strongly with the natural world. And we could kind of think about how we might be able to move our choices and decisions so that we're meeting our own needs while supporting the community to do the same, whilst also helping regenerate the natural world. Because when we talk about sustainability, we left it way too late to be sustainable. We should have started about 200 years ago. We've now got to the stage where we've eroded into the natural capital of the planet so badly that we have to regenerate it, we have to fix it. We can't survive, we will not survive at the rates as we currently are. We're at 416 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We will not be sustainable until we get it back to below 350. Again, that's made very clear in the Paris Agreement and in the Johan Rockström presentation on climate change. Is staying as we are is not enough. We've got to do something significantly better than that. And we've got to be able to communicate that in a way in which we can bring everyone on board. So I like to say that this sort of overlap area in the middle of the Venn diagram, the shaded area is, you're not going to achieve that with every single action that you do. And we shouldn't be beating ourselves up about it. But we have to understand that the world is nuanced and complicated. So there's me, I'm ambitious, I want to help change the world, I want to contribute, I want to work with other people. And that sometimes involves me flying to Africa, which is carbon dioxide emissions. So there's a compromise. And I don't think it's helpful if we're all trying to trip each other up, pointing out where we're not exactly perfect. And we understand that maybe as we coordinate our actions, all things start to gravitate towards the middle. Now imagine that's a dartboard, and every time your actions are sort of, the closer you get to the bullseye, the better that long-term effect is going to be. And if everybody would start to converge and to look at that lens and see how can you get those three circles to almost overlap each other, so that we're doing everything that we do is healthy and good for ourselves. It helps create a strong society whilst regenerating the natural world. That's what we have to get to. That's the ethical framework that I want you to kind of bear in mind. Now let's look at this slightly differently. Let's put ourselves in the middle. I'm going to kind of look at it as concentric circles. So there's me or you. You can look at that from your own perspective, obviously. And the center of my world. But I'm just a small subset of society that surrounds me. And everything that I do impacts and relates in some way to the surrounding society. So we have to, again, place ourselves, think consciously about our choices and actions and how they impact on the people around us. You can think about this also as in the kind of economic sphere. And for my sins, I was originally an economics teacher, so I like to put things in those frameworks. But every choice that you make, every purchase decision, every conscious choice that you make is going to impact on the outside world. And many of those things are economic decisions. So what we choose to buy, how we heat our home, how we operate in the wider world, the kind of job that we do, all of those things actually are economic decisions, and they have a big impact on shaping the external world. So I think one of the things that I'm trying to get across in this initial lecture is you need to understand your own personal power and the ability that you have to change and shape the world around you. It's way, way, way more powerful than you ever realize. And the more you start operating within that zone, the more then that sort of informs and shapes the society around you. Everything is a subset of the natural world. So instead of sort of looking at perhaps as the Venn diagram, I like to overlay these ethics and think about this. So the central idea is about me, how I meet my needs, the choices I make, and understanding that overflows and affects all the people and society around me. But all of that is a subset of the natural world. If we screw the natural world up, there's nothing. There's absolutely nothing for us. So there's always been this idea that, well, if we can make enough money and we've got some left over, we can afford then to spend a bit on the environment. And I honestly think we have to think of it the other way around. We're only going to have a healthy society if we have a strong and healthy environment. And the only way we're going to create a healthy environment is by understanding the power we have as an individual to shape it and inform it. And so we jump back to the SDGs, and the SDGs actually kind of sit within each other under the same sort of headings of what we've just been talking about. So I thought that was kind of interesting. When I think about the 17 SDGs, it's good. It's encouraging people to think about everything. But I think there's a more powerful way of looking at it, and that's by sitting them within each other. So we can see that certain ones relate to economic decisions, or things that the choices and actions that we make as individuals. The second ring is around society, around poverty, literacy, health, food, those kind of wider things. And again, all of those sit within the geophysical limits of our planet, the biosphere, the atmosphere, the seas, the earth. And right now we're toxifying the global atmosphere through climate change emissions, and also through the use of petrochemicals and all of these things. We've really got to understand that that's not how we will get to where we want to go. Okay. So let's just take all those words away, just to simplify it a little bit, and then just think about these three ideas that sit within each other. These are our ethics. This is how we want to try and see the world and how we communicate our values in permaculture. So the central thing is about me, it's about the individual, it's about the person, and about how they meet their needs, the choices that they make around their needs. So this is Maslow's hierarchy. And am I not plugged in power-wise? Not. Sorry, one sec. I was feeling dull. Somewhere there's this. It's like this. Oh, my screen was going dim, whereas I'm not plugged in. Okay, so it's interesting to think about human needs. I thought about this a lot when we were working in the refugee settlement in Bidi Bidi 2 years ago, about how, firstly, you have to meet your physiological needs. If you are cold and tired and hungry and naked and frightened, you're not thinking about other people. You're only thinking about your own survival. And these basic human needs obviously have to be met. And you're not being selfish by having food, water, warmth, rest. You could have more food than you need, but we need to meet these basic needs. And then also on top of that is this, we need to be safe and secure as well. So that's that next level. We're not just being, not to having, you know, fed yourself and watered yourself, but to have a degree of feeling of security. Now, again, it's very, very interesting and challenging with teaching permaculture in a refugee settlement of people who literally lost everything. Some of them would walk 200 miles through a swamp in South Sudan to get to Uganda. And the Ugandans, just to say, they'd let 1.5 million people into their country and told them that they're welcome to stay. I can't see that happening in UK, or we'll see what happens when Hong Kong goes bad. I think that's an extraordinary thing that they've done. And then our job was then to begin to help them meet their own physiological needs, rather than just existing on food handouts, is that slowly show people how to grow some food, how to grow some greens, how to create clean water, just, you know, start to raise the standard of living just a tiny bit. And by getting people to work together in teams, the security and safety comes from starting to get to know people. If the people around you are unfamiliar and a bit scary, then you don't ever really feel secure. And I think that incredibly important part about integrating people together. And again, I think something that permaculture can help us do is by making us all realize we're all on the same page, we're all working towards the same kinds of goals and objectives, and we're not actually in competition with each other at all. We're collaborating. So then beyond that, you then begin to get the ability then to be slightly less selfish and think about other people. Thinking about your intimate relationships, your friends, family, love, long-term connections. And that's when we move from the me to the we. Again, moving from just that thinking about our own needs at the center of that bullseye, of that diagram. And now we're moving into thinking a bit more about how we interact with other people and how we work with community. And then after that becomes much more longer, well, psychological needs, esteem, prestige, feeling of accomplishment. We all need to feel that we all thrive much better if we feel like we're achieving something and we're going somewhere. So another thing in permaculture is we encourage people to have a bit of a plan. You can always change your plan and update it and modify it, but if you've got a plan, you can get a sense of where you are and how you're progressing and where you're going to. And that, again, helps build self-esteem and a sense of accomplishment. I think that's all tremendously important. And then the self-actualization is this long-term creative goals that we might have. So if we go back to this sort of this idea about how we meet our needs and understand there's a hierarchy to that. And we have to understand that everybody else is trying to do that. So globally, as a human society, there shouldn't be hunger, you know, there really is no need for there to be hunger. It's not difficult to grow food, but it's a strategy that you need to enact. And if you can involve lots of other people in it, then it gets easier and easier. So then, yes, other people in society, and then the natural world, clean air, soils, forests, rivers, and seas. These are our 3 areas of concern. So this is how we like to summarize it in permaculture, is we call it earth care. Earth care is understanding that we are merely part of an interconnected, dynamic ecosystem. And it's absolutely in our own interest to value that and to value every single component of it. Because even the viruses, even the snakes, not everybody in Africa agrees with me about that, but we have to understand that every component of the ecosystem has a function. Everything has its place. So earth care is the recognition that things have the right to exist for their own right, not because they might be useful to people or we might be to exploit them in some way. Everything has its place. So, earth care, people care. The second layer of this is about understanding the importance of investing in people, in other people, into community and society, and understanding also that it's in our own interest to do that. We can do all of these things for purely selfish reasons. You don't even have to be nice. It kind of helps if you are, but it doesn't. That's not the motivation. The motivation for your individual survival is to have a strong community around you that will help support you, and within that be part of a really strong natural world, healthy natural world. So what we say so we've got earth care, people care, and the third ethic is a little bit hard to summarize, but it's about meeting your own needs and reinvesting the surplus. So here's a very important idea in permaculture: is you're not going to be sustainable if you can't meet your own needs and have something left over, which we call a surplus. We all might have a lean year or two where perhaps we have to dig into our surplus, but in the longer term, if you're not meeting your needs and having something left over to reinvest, you're not going to be sustainable. And therefore you need to make some changes, and you need to kind of evaluate your own operating system for yourself and your own life. Now, when I say surplus, it doesn't have to be money. We encourage very much to see things in terms of money, but it's not always the best way to look at things. It could be spare time. It could be just spare energy. You know, when you grow runner beans, when they come, you get so many runner beans, you don't know what to do with them. Well, what you do with those surplus runner beans is you give them to a neighbor. You build community with them. You make runner bean wine or something, whatever it is you do with runner beans. You use them as a tool so you reinvest that surplus into the surrounding community and into the environment. That's how we create the change that we need to do. So we're strong as individuals because we're meeting our own needs, but we're constantly putting our surplus into society to fulfill the wider goals. So one way of summarizing it is fair share. So we've got the earth care, people care, fair share. It's quite easy to remember. But really, it's about the constant. It's also one of my definitions of permaculture is the constant return of surplus, investing in society and the environment to create desired changes and objectives. So and these kind of equate and overlay to economy, society, and nature. So it's about thinking about our relationship. Every individual decision we make is in some way an economic decision, and those impact on society and nature around us. So how I meet out my needs, what I do with the surplus, my relationship to other people in society, and the relationship to the natural world, air, soils, forests, rivers and seas. Earth care, people care, fair share. There we go. Permaculture ethics in a nutshell for you. Any thoughts or questions? Any feedback? It all works on feedback. That's one of the, when we look into, thank you. When we look at nature, we realize everything seems to work on some kind of a feedback loop. So on a permaculture course, we also like to get feedback. So great. See a few hands going up. And yes. Okay, thanks for the link, Lindsay, on Zach Bush. It is very interesting. And I love Ron Finley, the gangster gardener. So that's a good link as well. Thanks for that. And there's lots of really great things to share. Ron Finley's got such a great can-do attitude. It's really worth a watch. We'll find a link for that. Yep. I can't remember what to do. Yes.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Thanks. One of my beliefs that I've come to is that the most important way of solving the environmental crisis is redistribution.
Yeah.
Redistribution of wealth. I once did sort of on the back of an envelope calculation using figures from not sure where, looking at total global wealth And if everybody gave up half their wealth and it was redistributed equally back to everybody, that would actually make a vast difference, because there is so much wealth concentrated in such small areas. And
Oh, lost you, Duncan. I've got so many windows open now.
Unmute. There we are. Sorry. The other strand of this idea is that obviously global population growth is really the biggest threat to the environment, I think. And the best way of controlling population is improving standard of living. And the best way of improving standard of living is redistribution, because the world can't cope with everybody increasing their standard of living to that of UK, United States, whatever, because that would take about 10 planets. So population, environmental improvement equals population control equals massive redistribution of world wealth. That's all I've got to say at the moment.
Great. If I might add to that with just a couple of thoughts. I'm getting lost of speed. I don't see myself anymore. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Can you hear me? Sorry.
Yes.
It's interesting, and I'll talk about population on, I think it is under principle 8, and there's a couple of observations we can make about that. But in permaculture, we like to say the problem is the solution. And a problem and its solution are really just the inverse of each other. And our kind of challenge is to see that. And I've thought about the population thing quite a lot. And what I actually think is, you're right to the degree, Duncan, we cannot live at UK standards with 7 billion people. That's definitely not happening. If we can evolve ourselves to a regenerative economy so that actually more people has a net benefit effect on the planet, then maybe we haven't got enough people. Maybe 7 billion isn't a lot of people. Maybe we need 30 or 50 billion people. We don't really know, because we've got nothing to measure that against. So I actually believe, and again, it's because, again, you're very, very right about the distribution of wealth. So 10% of the population have about 60% of the ecological impact. So when we say there's too many people, what we mean is there's too many people like us behaving like us. And I think the average Ugandan has 1/1000th of the carbon footprint of an American. So it's not, certainly aren't too many Ugandans, even though their population is expanding very fast. But it's very critical about how we behave and how we, and possibly, and I can't guarantee this, but I really suspect that we ought to be able to have a regenerative impact, that collectively or individually we ought to be, if you plant more trees than you cut down, you're leaving behind a legacy. Bill Mollison, the founder of permaculture, defined it like this. He said, you can look at sustainability as many different ways as you want, but if you're not building healthy topsoil, you will not survive. You cannot survive. The only new income, the only new energy coming into the system, coming into the earth, is from the sun. Think about that. The only net energy gain that we're coming is the solar flux, solar energy that's coming in, and we can't access that. You can sit out in the sun and get a nice tan and get nice and warm, but you're going to starve to death because you can't convert that sunlight into energy. Whereas plants can, because plants can photosynthesize. So every living thing on planet has to build a relationship with plants. And in some way, plants are the only things that can convert sunlight into stored sugars and carbohydrates. So everything about how the planet works is to do with relationships. Nothing exists in isolation. And if we can make those relationships harmonious and mutually beneficial, then who knows how many people we can sustain. And if people are educated, supported, empowered, then they can plant a lot of trees and they can pick up a lot of plastic out of all the hedgerows and all the things that we know we need to do. And the question is, how do we activate that? How do we get all of those people on board, doing things, changing things? And this is obviously part of the conversation that we're having. In development terms, Duncan, just another point you made there is really interesting, is the only thing that slows down, the thing that correlates most strongly with slowing down population growth is investing in women. The more education, the more economic power, the more ability to control their own lives that women have, then they tend to have children slightly later and have longer gaps between the births, which is much more sustainable. And obviously it doesn't put families under so much stress of having multiple childbirths in a few short years, which again is a big reality for people in the majority world. So I do agree with you, but I'm going to add that little sort of, if you like, bit on top that says, maybe it's not too many people. The key thing is how those people behave. So I'll say that.
All I'd say is I really think we have enough. We don't need any more.
It's very hard to know how to do that. If you say, if we've got too many people, how are we going to thin them out? And obviously the answer is, yeah, we have to invest in education and personal empowerment and things like that, rather than any other more drastic measures. Yeah.
Steve?
Yes.
And Duncan, can I just add to that? And I suppose, obviously, everyone's completely entitled to their own opinion, and that's what's wonderful about opinion. But in terms of, yes, there are probably a lot of people on the planet, and some argue too many. And this is something as a woman I've also thought about, because I would like children at some point. And I suppose there is kind of a pressure, being a modern young woman, thinking, do I want to have children? Because is that going to add an environmental impact? And am I going to damage them? Bring my carbon footprint down? But I think, similar to what you were saying, as long as people change the way that we're living and we live in a more kind of sustainable, if you like, but less consumerism and that kind of thing. You know, Hannah brings, sorry to involve you, Hannah, but from my point of view, Hannah brings her 2 children up in an incredible way, as lots of other families do, because she uses lots of reusable things. She teaches her children to play with nature and to use materials that we can just find elsewhere. They're not adding to this consumerist kind of society. And I think if people start to make that shift and that change, then it will maybe become more bearable how many people there are on the planet, because people are making shifts into how much we're demanding, extracting from the planet. And I suppose a lot of that goes back to what you say about educating women and young families. Once we're putting that and investing into women, and, you know, teaching them and teaching young families how they can provide for themselves, and also by how having children at a later date, you know, may benefit in some ways, and we'll have that gap, so then there are being less children being born. You know, I think there's a whole bunch of things, but to me, especially consumerism and the way that people act and how our demands for things is more important necessarily than the amount of people on the planet.
I think the other thing is that Steve said, like, are there enough people, which is an interesting question. Like, in my life, there aren't enough people to do all the jobs. Like, it's all very nice to think, I'd like to go pick litter out of the hedges or whatever, but I don't have the time. So yeah, I don't know. I think like the community thing is really important, because if I had more people in my life and we could you know, live as bigger families, all helping each other out, then that would free up some time for me, like, on, you know, on a micro scale. But if you're thinking of this like in the bigger picture as well, then, you know, that all works really well to sort of, you know, work together as a community. And then we've got that excess potentially where we can go and give back and do things. Because yeah, talking about excess, I don't think I have much excess time or energy to do anything with it, so.
Later on the course, I'm going to talk a bit about this gentleman, Robert Owen, who was from Newtown, 1771, so quite a while ago now. And he was the guy who created the world's first mutual company. He was interested in cooperatives and things like that. And he was really, he's called a social visionary. But he really believed in investing in people. That's my point. He believed everybody could be transformed by education. And I think that's something which perhaps we're only going to start to address these problems and create the changes that we need by really valuing and investing in people and improving their awareness, empowering them so that they can make more positive changes. And I think that can be the driver for what has to come. And in the process probably of doing that, the population kind of paradigm, if you like, will sort itself out as people become more empowered. We have to, I don't really see any other mechanism that we have to go forward other than some kind of dictatorial hell. So we have to believe in the power of individuals, invest in people, and yeah, help everybody become part of this transitional process. I guess that's what
can I just say something, Steve?
Sure, Shan.
First of all, can you give me permission to say something? Because obviously I come from a different framework to you, so I don't want to share that if it's not appropriate, but it's something that I'm working out within the context of permaculture, so I'm happy to not share it. But if you're okay with me sharing it.
Yeah, I'll say one thing before you do, just to sort of frame it a little bit, is obviously I've been working in places with very different cultures, and we're working with in parts of Uganda, they're very, very Christian. Everything's all about Jesus. Other parts, they're all Muslim, and everything's about, you know, Allah or whatever. And what we realize is that these belief systems that we have that help center us in places in the world are really, really important. But what we have to do is find a consensus about the things that we all agree about, and the things that we, if you like, the things that we're on, you know, one's a Sunni, one's a Shia. How do we reconcile that when we end up, we're going to have a fight, or we're going to go, do you know what? These are beautiful ideas that help center our place in the world, but that's not necessarily the basis that we're going to build our consensus on, because we all have a slightly different cultural take on that.
Yeah, no, that's right. But I think also it's important, you know, from my point of view, I was watching Spring Watch for the first time last week, and I don't know if any of you watched it before, but the guys were so amazing. They were like extolling the beauty of nature, and they were really passionate about it, commenting on the healing aspect of it in COVID and whatever. It was a lovely way of seeing the presenters do that. Yeah. And just my understanding of the world, if it's okay, and my personal experience as well, that man was never intended to be the center of the universe, but the God is, and he's the one that created the world. So all the beauty and amazing things is just display of his awesome character and love, and all the principles that you're at work in terms of, you know, growth, harmony and abundance, which actually I didn't realize was permaculture, but what we've got in the Cross Keys is growth, support and celebration, which is similar, is all about being one. And actually what I've learned recently is that the whole purpose of Jesus coming was to ensure that heaven and earth ultimately become unified. So I think we're all on the same tracks, and it's all about respect and listening and enjoying each other. And I think the whole thing about worrying about having too many people, the one thing that I believe, two things that from my understanding, is that God gave us two commissions to do, which was to be fruitful and multiply, have kids, and to look after the world. So yeah, so that's just something interesting. But I, you know, just in terms of, and I do believe that there are it's not just the sun that's the resource and energizes, but God gives energy as well. So it's just sort of sharing that. And I could tell you the story of the Cross Keys, which is very interesting and miraculous. So I've just seen that energy, if you like, in my life. So I believe that God's the source of everything, not the sun necessarily. But I'm happy to listen. And like I said,
I'm talking very much in an energetic point of view. So in terms of you know, being able to, the energy that's coming in that powers, that allows plants to photosynthesize, is solar energy, not the energy of a deity. But at the same time, it's, you know, we're inspired by these things. These are things that make us actually human. And I also really agree with you that we've got a very Homo sapiens centric view of the world, and I think that we're not anything like as important as we think we are. and that we're all connected. And really, that's very true. So I just put up a picture, which I hope you can see, which is evolution and how the biodiversity of our planet has come about. So we're going to think just a little bit about that. I'm going to talk about the history of our planet a little bit, just to kind of put things in a context, because I find this really fascinating. So this is a beautiful diagram of life's family tree. And it's a little bit, if you look at it, it starts in the middle. The timeline in the middle starts at 4 billion years ago. And then it goes, the timeline comes out in concentric rings, if that makes sense, if you can see that. And there's a few things about this which really fascinate me. So, and we're going to enlarge on this tomorrow, but I just thought it's good to know where we've all come from and how we got here. And planet Earth 4 billion years ago, about 4.5 billion years ago, was a swirling ball of gases, and which slowly started to cool down, and slowly the mantle of the Earth started to form. It was very thin and it was very hot, and all of the land mass was in one place. There was no plate tectonic movement or anything like that at the beginning. It was because the world was too energetic and hot in the early days. Now, what is extraordinary is that the first life on Earth came about really quite quickly. 500 million years, they reckon. There's 3.5 billion years. Actually, there's a fossil they have in the Natural Museum in Cardiff of stromatolites, of an organism which lived 3.7 billion years ago, and they can date that in the rocks. And what's extraordinary is they still exist today. So there are organisms that have been on this planet for 3.7 billion years, which is just extraordinary. And what we see when we explore this timeline, we go to 4 billion years ago. So about 3.5 billion years ago was the first very simple life forms, and they actually weren't generated by solar energy. They were created by the energy from the rocks in the Earth. There was streams of water sort of coming into contact with hot rocks, which would have separated out chemicals, and started to create very simple patterns, very simple densities of one thing in one place and another thing in another place. And slowly, but really extraordinarily early on, very simple forms of life started to appear on Earth. And some people have to really speculate that it's almost kind of hardwired into it. There's this sort of pattern formation that happens just naturally. And those first forms of life, of course, would have been incredibly simple things, unicellular organisms. And we go from 3 billion years to 2 billion years ago. And then between 3 and 2 billion, you'll notice it says the oceans rust. What do you think that might mean? Any idea? How could the ocean be rusty? Something very important happened then. And what happened was, at that part of the evolutionary timeline, was that the first organisms that could photosynthesize came about. And that was these stromatolites we're talking about. There are also cyanobacteria that could also photosynthesize. Photosynthesize is that thing of being able to take the energy from the sun and capture it, joining CO2 and H2O together to create sugars. And in that process, it releases oxygen. And so all of the oxygen that's on our planet was generated, or is being generated by life on the planet. So there's incredible, almost creationist thing there, Shan, just to think about how perhaps you might be seeing this, but is that life creates life. Life has created the conditions for life. And none of us would be here if it wasn't for these strange, spongy things that look a bit like rocks, called these stromatolites. They're our great-great-grandparents in some really strange way. They help create the atmosphere that we breathe. So this is again, start to begin to understand the connectivity of life, how everything is so sort of hardwired together. So when it says oceans rust, what that means is that all of the dissolved ferrous compounds in the sea, there'll be lots of iron just dissolved in the sea, and that reacted with the oxygen, and it created rust, ferrous oxide, and that all deposited out onto the seabeds. And all of the iron ore deposits on the planet are the same age because they were created, it was as a result of this ocean oxidation, which is really fascinating. So again, that brings us into this idea that we really have to try to keep central purpose. Life is created by life, and the more life you have, the more possibility it creates for more life. It's an incredible thing. Okay, to say, so obviously this diagram we're looking at, each one of those little branches represents genetic diversity. It represents a different sort of family tree of different organisms evolving away. They've put a few mass extinctions in just to kind of give you a sense of it, but most of them they've left out. So what we're seeing is the things that have evolved and are still here now. And it's interesting to say, even though we're living now in the 6th mass extinction, there's never been more biodiversity on the planet than there is right now. We've never had more different species than we currently have. So that's kind of that's also a very interesting thing to bear in mind. And as much as it's terrifying to think of mass die-offs, historically when they've happened, nature has always come back stronger and come back with more species and more diversity. So sometimes if there is a die-off, nature kicks back with another surge of growth and diversity. So that's a kind of interesting thing to think about too. So if we go on, look at the left-hand side, then we can see that the first organisms, they fall into 2 categories, the bacteria and archaea. And bacteria we know a bit about. Archaea are very strange things that can eat sulfur and give out methane, things that don't live in aerobic environments. You have archaea organisms living in your gut, in the soil. They've retreated. So you can also imagine that as the planet developed, as the things like stromatolites started releasing oxygen, all of the anaerobes, the anaerobic organisms, the things that don't breathe oxygen, had to retreat out because the environment became poison for them, and they retreated into the soil, into the gut of other animals, into places where there aren't any oxygen. So that's an interesting kind of thought. And it took, after we go back to about 1 billion years ago, there was then enough oxygen in the atmosphere to have more complex organisms. And those more complex organisms are called eukaryotes. Eukaryotic organisms are things that have multiple cells, have separate nuclei and different structures within them. And so for the first 3 billion years or something like that of evolution, basically everything was just like a mass of bacteria and very early proto-fungi and things like that. I'll be introducing you a little bit to the work of Paul Stamets as we go through this, who's a mycologist. He's one of the leading people who knows about mushrooms, about mycelium. And he postulates, which is again kind of interesting, is the first life on Earth was in the sea, was in the water. So he then wonders, well, what was the first life on land? What was the first organism that managed to exist on land? And he thinks maybe it was fungi. It was mycelium. And all land-based creatures have an origin relating back to fungi. So maybe there are closer relatives than we realize. And also some of those fungi managed to team up with unicellular algae to create lichens, which are a composite organism of a plant and 2 different fungi operating within the same structure. And so lichens could photosynthesize, so they could create sugars, which they can make those sugars available to the fungi, the fungal component. And the fungi can dissolve rocks, can access minerals, and swap those minerals for the sugars with the algae component of the lichen. So again, it gives a little bit of an insight into life works as a team. Things actually interact with each other and team up. And maybe one of the ways that we got complex eukaryotic organisms was because very simple things actually merged together and became part of a bigger whole. So there's even a school of thought that thinks that the mitochondria, the actual structures in the cell nucleus that help deliver energy to the cell, could be considered as a separate organism. So it's quite interesting to think as well. We're composite creatures. So anyway, I digress slightly, but as you can see the Ice Age, and you can see after the Ice Age, we've got massive expansion of prototomes. I don't even know what that is. And well, you can see how the diversity has expanded. There's been these mass extinctions. We're now into the 6th one, but each time nature's come back. And you only start to get to the mammals oh, that's not it. Sorry. I thought something else was going to happen then. Here we go. It's all very recent, all this mammal stuff. It's only actually, we go back, we've got very early mammals back here, about 250 million years ago. And then it's not really until after the dinosaurs dried out 65 million years ago. That was a huge expansion of
I think we lost Steve.
Yeah, frozen, doesn't he? It must be at his end. So
He's going through a mass extinction.
okay. Oh no. Share about that. We just dropped out. Our signal dropped, so I just had to re-find my place. So I was just saying how it's only, if we can look at the first mammals go back 250 million years in the evolutionary timeline, but really it's a very small amount of diversity, and it wasn't really until there was a big mass die-off 200 million years ago, and then we can see that was another one 65 million years ago. That was the end of the large dinosaurs, and that die-off enabled an explosion of the mammals. And at first there were some very big and amazing things, sort of the megafauna. And you can see that really we are very recent arrivals. And looking at this sort of genetic family tree, what you have to realize again is it's what we've inherited from all of these predecessors organisms we've inherited their DNA. So in terms of actual information, the DNA within our cells, we humans we're 70% fruit fly, which is an amazing thing. And you think about that, well, none of us really look like a fruit fly, but the bit of you that's 70% fruit fly is the ability to synthesize proteins and enzymes and your immune system and things like that. Those things, it takes a lot of evolution to evolve those particular, if you like, mechanisms, and then that's being shared across this whole sort of genome of all of us that live on the planet. So we all come from a common origin. This is what Charles Darwin postulated 200 years ago in Shrewsbury, we have to say. So we celebrate our local people, and it's taken all of these millions of years, billions of years, to get to humans, and we're pretty new. If you go back about 2 million years, we were hominid ancestors, but they, you know, they would have been quite different from what we are now. We've only really been modern humans as how, what, 500,000 years or something like that, Homo sapiens. And the very first, just while we're in this and thinking about this, this is something that came out recently from research, which I thought was really interesting, is the very first Homo sapiens sapiens even, because we are the subset of that. So we are wise people. We're not just Homo sapiens, we're double wise. The very first hominids that were Homo sapiens came from quite close to where Victoria Falls is, somewhere between Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia. There's that amazing little part of the world there, and that's where our first ancestors are. So we're all African. Ultimately, we all ultimately come from Africa, and we've evolved into this globalized society. But it's very, very interesting to think about where we came from and how it's life itself that's created the conditions for life. So as we erode into the biosphere, as we remove the forests, as we change the atmosphere, we're undermining the very thing that got us here. We as humans, we tend to try and simplify things. Nature's complicated and messy and three-dimensional, and as our little monkey brains that we have, we try to simplify things. And in the process of doing that, we've eroded massively into the biosphere that supports us. So, and this is the idea, just going back to this Dr. Zach Bush and his ideas of evolutionary biology. And he's saying, in many ways, once you've understood that 99% of all life on Earth is microbial, and that by changing the atmosphere and pumping out pollution, we're undermining the ability of the planet to support that life. We're soaking the soils in glyphosate and horrible toxic poisons that are having a really big impact on it's almost like we're at war with the microbiome of our planet. And what he said is, it's not surprising that we've triggered an immune response from Gaia, from the natural world, from Mother Nature, he calls it. But we try to think about nature as this dynamic, interconnected thing, that none of the organisms are separate from it. We're all somehow layered together, interconnected. And through our own kind of stupidity, we're now plowing into that biodiversity and simplifying it and eroding into it. And that's the lesson that COVID-19 is trying to teach us. That's what Zach Bush would say. I don't know whether that's a way to look at it or not, but it's kind of interesting that's where we are and how we've got there. Okay. I'm just going to come out of that. It's 11:26, so we said we'd have a half an hour break then, a bit of a stretch. And again, we'll leave the window open for chat. But any questions, feedback? I'm always interested to get people's initial feelings. And yeah, just any if you only want to contribute anything, then I would like to hear.
You can also put feedback in the chat down the side, and you can choose to send it to Steve privately, to me, as well as publicly. So please feel free to use that.
Thanks, Lisa. I saw Duncan with your hand up.
Sorry, me again. Another question. You said that all the oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere is produced as a result of photosynthesis, initially by the bacteria and archaea or whatever, which begs the question: where is all the does all the sequestered carbon in the soil, the forests, etc., equate to that amount of oxygen? I mean, obviously there are vast deposits of coal, oil, gas, which account for some of them, but you know, does it add up?
That's a bit of mathematics I haven't done, so I don't know. But it would be interesting, wouldn't it? I mean, if you can think about limestone and chalk, these are organic things, calcium carbonate. So there's a lot of carbon locked into the earth. And I think this idea that because looking at climate change, start to think about carbon in the atmosphere as being a bad thing because it traps in heat and it's changing the atmosphere. But carbon in the ground is a really good thing. And actually carbon is the building block of life. All life on Earth is carbon based. So it's actually a very important building block, but it needs to be in the soil and not in the air, to a degree. I didn't really answer your question, but I didn't know the answer.
Okay, maybe if I've got time, I'll see if I can do any research into that and come back to you.
Lindsay.
So it's just a clarifying question, but you mentioned, I think Paul, but I didn't catch his surname, who was the mycelium expert. Could you?
Paul Stamets.
Stamets or Stammers, Stammits.
I just put it in the chat.
Brilliant, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, well, we'll have a bit of we'll have a stretch, have a half an hour break, and we'll be back at 12, and then we'll do another hour and a half. And we'll leave the chat on in the meantime. Okay? Thanks, everyone.
Book for that.
Thanks, Steve.
Thank you.
Steve, do we need the book for that?